There are places in Montana where the wilderness doesn't just surround you, it swallows you whole, where the lodgepole pines grow so thick that daylight barely touches the forest floor, and the silence is so complete you can hear your own heartbeat drumming in your ears. The Bitterroot Range is one of those places, beautiful, unforgiving, ancient. And in October of 2018, it became the setting for a mystery that would haunt investigators, search teams, and one small-town sheriff for the next 5 years. Claire Holloway came to Montana seeking solitude. At 31, she'd built a modest career as a freelance wildlife photographer, the kind of work that demanded patience, resilience, and a comfort with isolation that most people don't possess. Her portfolio showed a particular gift for capturing animals in their most unguarded moments. A fox mid-leap through fresh snow, an elk lifting its head at dawn, eyes reflecting the first light. She had an editor in Seattle waiting on a series about predator-prey dynamics in the Northern Rockies, and she'd rented a remote cabin for 3 weeks that autumn to get the shots she needed. The cabin belonged to a retired forest ranger named Douglas Kern, who owned several properties he rented to hunters and photographers. It sat 40 miles from the nearest town of Prospect, accessible only by a logging road that turned to mud in spring and became impassable once the heavy snows came. Kern had warned Claire about the isolation when she booked it. No cell service, he'd told her over the phone. No neighbors. The creek runs clean if you need water, but you're on your own for everything else. Most people find it too quiet. Claire had laughed at that, he remembered later. Said quiet was exactly what she was looking for. She checked in on October 8th, picking up the keys from Kern's office in Prospect. He remembered her as polite but reserved, declining his offer to drive out and show her the property. "I've got good maps," she'd said, hefting her camera bag and a duffel of supplies. "I'll find it." And she did. Kern's logbook showed she arrived at the cabin that afternoon, noted by a text message she sent to her sister back in Oregon, the last one that would go through before she drove beyond cell range. "Made it. Place is perfect. Talk in a few weeks." For the first week, Claire existed in that perfect solitude she'd been seeking. Kern had installed a guestbook in the cabin, and she'd written in it sporadically notes about weather, wildlife sightings, the quality of light at different times of day. Professional observations mostly, but occasionally something more personal would slip through. October 11th, saw a wolf this morning, or maybe a large coyote. Hard to tell at that distance. Moved differently than I expected. Graceful but careful, like it knew it was being watched. And then a day later, October 12th, strange how quiet it gets here at night. Not peaceful quiet. Listening quiet. Detective Sarah Lindquist, who would later lead the investigation, found those words unsettling when she first read them. "You have to understand," she told me when we spoke in her office in Missoula, "people who spend time alone in the wilderness, they develop a kind of intuition, a sense for when something's off." Claire was experienced. She knew the woods. If she felt something was different, something probably was. But different how? That was the question that would define everything that followed. On October 15th, Claire stopped writing in the guestbook. The last entry was brief, almost hurried. "Heard something large moving through the brush behind the cabin last night. Couldn't see it. We'll check for tracks in the morning." There was no entry for the morning. No note about what she found or didn't find. Just silence after that, the remaining pages blank. October 23rd, 8 days later, was when everything unraveled. Douglas Kern had planned to check on the property, a routine visit he made toward the end of every rental period. The logging road had taken damage from an early storm, and he wanted to assess whether it needed repairs before winter truly set in. He drove out mid-morning, his truck bouncing over the rutted track, and immediately noticed Claire's Subaru still parked beside the cabin. That alone wasn't alarming. She'd rented the place through the end of the month. But something about the scene felt wrong to him, even from a distance. The cabin door was closed, but unlocked. Claire's boots were lined up neatly on the porch, her camera resting on the railing like she'd stepped inside for just a moment. Kern called her name. No answer. He knocked, waited, then pushed the door open. What he found inside would become the subject of countless theories, official reports, and late-night speculation for years to come. The cabin was undisturbed. No signs of struggle, no overturned furniture, no broken glass. A half-finished mug of tea sat on the small wooden table, the liquid inside still faintly warm to the touch. An open journal lay beside it, Claire's handwriting flowing across the page in neat lines until it stopped abruptly mid-sentence. I think I understand now what I've been hearing. It's not staying away anymore. That's where the sentence ended. The pen lay across the page, a small ink blot where she'd paused or been interrupted. Kern's hands were shaking when he called the sheriff's office from town an hour later. He'd searched the immediate area around the cabin, calling Claire's name until his voice went hoarse, checking the creek bed and the nearby trails. Nothing. No response. No trace. He'd touched as little as possible inside, some instinct telling him this was now a crime scene, or at least something that needed official attention. When Deputy Marcus Petrell arrived 2 hours later with a second unit, they conducted a more thorough search, and that's when the strangeness really began to crystallize. Claire's belongings were all accounted for. Her duffel bag sat at the foot of the bed, clothes neatly folded. Her toiletries lined the bathroom shelf. Her wallet, ID, and car keys lay on the kitchen counter. The Subaru's tank was still half full. Most tellingly, her camera equipment, thousands of dollars worth of lenses and gear, remained untouched. For a wildlife photographer, that equipment was everything. You didn't leave it behind willingly. The fireplace held ashes that were still warm, not hot, but retaining enough heat to suggest a fire had burned within the last few hours. Someone had banked it carefully, the way you do when you plan to return. A pot of coffee sat on the propane stove, about a third full room temperature. The bed was made, dishes were washed and drying beside the sink. Everything suggested someone who intended to come back, who'd stepped out for a brief moment and expected to return to a space exactly as they'd left it. Except Claire Holloway never came back. Deputy Petrell radioed for additional units, and within hours, the cabin became the center of a missing person investigation. Sheriff Tom Gallagher arrived personally, a veteran lawman who'd seen his share of wilderness disappearances over the years. Most of them ended in tragedy. Hikers who'd fallen, gotten lost, succumbed to exposure. But most of them also left clear evidence of what had happened. This one felt different. First thing we do in cases like this, Gallagher explained to the deputies assembling at the scene, is establish a timeline and a search radius. We work outward from the last known location in expanding circles. We look for footprints, disturbed vegetation, anything that tells us which direction the person went. He paused, looking at the cabin with narrowed eyes. But we also keep our minds open. People disappear in the woods for a lot of reasons. Not all of them are obvious. The initial search began that afternoon, before the light failed. A team of 6 deputies and volunteers spread out from the cabin in careful lines, marking their progress, calling Claire's name. The forest absorbed their voices, giving nothing back. The ground was partially frozen, covered in pine needles and patches of early snow, making tracks difficult to identify. They found deer prints, elk, what might have been a mountain lion near the creek, but nothing clearly human extending away from the cabin in any direction. That's when Deputy Lila Ortiz, searching the perimeter about 50 yards behind the cabin, found the first anomaly. She called the others over, pointing at the ground without speaking. There, pressed into a patch of soft mud near a fallen log, was a print. Large, deeper than the surrounding soil, with an unusual shape that didn't quite match any common wildlife. It had a vaguely canine structure, elongated with visible toe impressions, but the size was wrong. Too large for a wolf, too defined for a bear, and the spacing was strange, as if whatever made it had been moving on 2 legs rather than 4. "Could be a person in boots," Sheriff Gallagher suggested, crouching to examine it more closely. "Maybe someone passing through." Ortiz shook her head slowly. "The depth is wrong for boots, and there's no tread pattern, just pressure, like something heavy stepped here and kept going." She pointed ahead, where the forest thickened. "There might be more." They followed the trail, if you could call it that, for another 30 yards before losing it entirely on harder ground. 3 more prints, each similar to the first, spaced roughly 4 feet apart. Too far for a walking human, too deliberate for an animal moving through its territory. They led deeper into the forest, toward a section of dense undergrowth, where the pines grew so close together that visibility dropped to a few feet. "We'll need dogs," Gallagher said finally, straightening up, "and more daylight. We're not going into thick brush in the dark, not without proper equipment." He looked back toward the cabin, barely visible through the trees now. "But we mark this. Document everything. Something came through here recently." What he didn't say, what no one wanted to say that first night, was that the prints were heading away from the cabin, not toward it. As darkness fell, the search teams withdrew to regroup and plan the next day's efforts. The cabin was secured as a potential crime scene, yellow tape strung across the porch, a deputy posted outside overnight. Sheriff Gallagher established a command post in Prospect, reaching out to the state police and search and rescue organizations. By morning, they'd have dogs, helicopters, thermal imaging equipment, professional search teams who'd worked dozens of wilderness cases. This was no longer just a missing person. This was a full-scale operation. But that first night, sitting in the cabin with the door closed and the darkness pressing against the windows, Deputy Petrell noticed something that would haunt his report later. The scratches on the window frame. They were high up near the top of the glass, thin parallel lines gouged into the wood. Fresh, judging by the lighter color of the exposed wood beneath. He photographed them carefully, measured them. 4 lines, evenly spaced, each about 4 inches long. Could have been made by a tool, maybe, or branches scraping in the wind. But the window faced away from the prevailing wind direction, and there were no trees close enough to reach it. And when he looked closer, he saw the faint residue caught in the grooves. Something organic, slightly greasy, with a smell that was animal but not quite identifiable. Musky, damp, with a faint metallic undertone. He bagged a sample, labeled it, added it to the growing collection of evidence that didn't quite make sense. Outside, the forest was completely silent. No wind rustling the branches, no animals calling, no nighttime sounds, just silence, thick and waiting. In Seattle, Claire's sister Emma Holloway was receiving a phone call that would shatter her world. Sheriff Gallagher kept it brief. Claire was missing, search operations were underway. They'd know more soon. Emma's first reaction was disbelief. Claire was competent, experienced, careful. She didn't get lost. She didn't make mistakes in the wilderness. "You don't understand," Emma told the sheriff, her voice tight with rising panic. "Claire knows what she's doing. If she's missing, something happened to her. Something made her disappear." Those words, "something made her disappear," would echo through the investigation for years. By morning, the search operation had grown exponentially. 40 volunteers, 3 K9 units, a helicopter equipped with thermal imaging, and a specialized wilderness rescue team from Missoula. They spread out from the cabin in carefully coordinated patterns, searching every drawer, every ridge, every dense thicket. The dogs picked up Claire's scent immediately. Her clothing from the cabin gave them a clear target. And they led their handlers on a winding path into the forest behind the property, noses to the ground, pulling at their leads. The trail went east, following roughly the same direction as those strange prints from the night before. It crossed the creek at a narrow point where the water ran shallow over smooth stones, continued up a steep embankment thick with deadfall and thorny brush, then turned sharply north along a game trail that showed signs of recent use. The dogs were confident at first, tails up, tracking with clear purpose, but after half a mile, something changed. They began to hesitate, circling back, whining softly. Their handlers, experienced trackers who'd worked with these animals for years, exchanged worried glances. "They've got something," one handler said. A woman named Rita Volker, who'd brought her German Shepherd Kodiak down from Kalispell. "But they don't like it. See how he's holding back? That's not confusion. That's avoidance." Kodiak was a veteran search dog, certified in both live find and cadaver detection, with dozens of successful searches to his credit. He didn't spook easily, but now he was pulling backward on the lead, ears flat, a low rumble building in his chest. Rita knelt beside him, checking for injuries, looking for anything that might explain the sudden change in behavior. Nothing obvious. She let him smell Claire's clothing again, gave the search command. Kodiak moved forward reluctantly, and within 20 yards he stopped completely, sat down, and refused to go further. The other two dogs reacted similarly. They'd tracked to a certain point, roughly the same location, a clearing where the game trail opened up beneath a stand of old-growth pines, and then they'd stop, whining, pacing, clearly distressed. One of them, a bloodhound named Sadie, actually backed away and tried to return to the handler's vehicle. "I've never seen this," another handler admitted, frustration evident in his voice. "The scent doesn't just vanish. It has to go somewhere. But they're telling us it ends here, and they won't go past it." Detective Lindquist, who'd arrived from Missoula that morning to take over the investigation, stood in the clearing, trying to make sense of it. The ground showed disturbance, flattened grass, broken twigs, signs that something had moved through recently. She photographed everything, directed her team to search the immediate area on foot, expanding outward in grids. They found more of those unusual prints, pressed into softer ground at the clearing's edge. They found what might have been a partial handprint on a fallen log, too smudged to be certain, but suggesting someone had braced themselves there. And they found something else, something that made Lindquist's stomach tighten. A piece of fabric, denim torn and caught on a low branch at the clearing's far side. The color matched the description of Claire's jacket. There was no blood on it, no signs of violence, just a clean tear as if it had been snagged in passing. But the branch it was caught on was 7 feet off the ground. "How does that happen?" Deputy Ortiz asked, staring up at it. "You don't walk into a branch at that height. You'd have to be climbing or jumping or—" She didn't finish the sentence. No one wanted to speculate out loud. The search continued for 3 more days, expanding to cover a 5-mile radius from the cabin. Helicopter overflights using thermal imaging turned up nothing. Ground teams combed through thick brush, checked abandoned hunting camps, searched along the creek and every tributary. Divers checked deeper pools where someone might have fallen and been swept away. Nothing. Claire Holloway had simply vanished, leaving behind only fragments, a scrap of fabric, some ambiguous footprints, and a journal entry that suggested she'd been aware of something in the woods with her. On the 4th day, with storms moving in and visibility dropping, Sheriff Gallagher made the difficult decision to scale back active searching and shift to recovery mode. The temperatures were dropping below freezing at night now. If Claire was out there unsheltered, the odds of survival were diminishing rapidly. Emma Holloway drove out from Seattle, desperate for answers, and Lindquist had to sit with her in a quiet corner of the sheriff's office and explain that they were doing everything possible, but the wilderness was vast and unforgiving. "What about those footprints?" Emma demanded, her voice raw. "You said they found unusual tracks. What kind of animal makes tracks like that?" Lindquist chose her words carefully. "We're consulting with wildlife experts to identify them. It could be a bear, a large wolf, possibly a mountain lion. The ground conditions make clear identification difficult." "But you don't know." "No," Lindquist admitted. "We don't know." Emma pulled out her phone, showed Lindquist text messages from Claire, the last few conversations they'd had before she lost cell service. Most were mundane. updates about the drive, comments about the weather. But one message, sent on October 12th, stood out. Forest feels different here, hard to explain, like something's paying attention. Probably just me being paranoid, LOL. Lindquist copied the messages, added them to the case file. Every piece of information mattered, even the seemingly trivial ones, especially those. As October gave way to November and the first heavy snows began to fall, the Bitterroot Range transformed into an impenetrable white maze. The logging road became impassable. The cabin sat empty and locked, preserved as evidence, though everyone knew the real crime scene, if there was one, lay somewhere in the thousands of acres of forest surrounding it. The official status remained missing person, active investigation, but resources were diverted elsewhere and the regular search operations ceased. Detective Lindquist didn't give up, though. Something about the case gnawed at her, kept her reviewing the evidence late at night, searching for patterns. She interviewed Douglas Kern multiple times, asking about previous renters, whether anyone else had reported unusual experiences at that property. Kern was reluctant at first, protective of his business reputation, but eventually he admitted there'd been incidents. "Nothing concrete," he said, sitting in his office with the door closed, voice low. "But over the years, maybe 3 or 4 times, people have cut their rentals short, said they felt uncomfortable, heard things at night. One guy, a hunter from Idaho, he packed up after 2 days and wouldn't give a reason. Just said the place had a bad feeling and he wanted his deposit back." Kern rubbed his face tiredly. "I always figured it was just city folks, not used to how quiet it gets out there, how dark. Your mind plays tricks when you're alone like that." "Did any of them mention seeing anything?" Lindquist pressed. "Not just hearing or feeling, actually seeing something?" Kern hesitated, then nodded slowly. "One woman. This was maybe 3 years back. She was a writer, rented the cabin for a month to finish a novel. About a week in, she called me from town, said she'd driven out because she needed to use a phone, told me she'd seen something watching the cabin from the tree line at dusk, something tall and dark that moved wrong. That's how she put it, moved wrong. Not like a person, not like an animal, something in between." He met Lindquist's eyes. "I drove out there with her, looked around, didn't find anything. She still left the next day. Wouldn't stay another night. These stories didn't make it into the official reports. They were too vague, too reliant on subjective fear and interpretation. But Lindquist noted them in her personal files, kept building a picture of the location that went beyond simple geography. There was a history here, a pattern of unease that predated Claire's disappearance. Whether that meant anything concrete or was just the natural human response to isolation, she couldn't say. Not yet. Was it possible that Claire Holloway had simply walked away from her life, staged her own disappearance? Lindquist had to consider it. People did that sometimes, walked into the wilderness and chose not to come back. But everything argued against it. Claire's life showed no signs of distress or crisis. Her bank accounts remained untouched. Her photography career was thriving. She had close relationships with her sister, a circle of friends, future assignments booked through the following spring, and she'd left behind everything of value: her equipment, her identification, her vehicle. If you were starting over, you took those things. You didn't leave them neatly arranged in a remote cabin like props in a stage set. The alternative explanations were equally problematic. Foul play? There was no evidence of another person at the scene, no signs of struggle, no forensic traces suggesting violence. Accidental injury. Search teams had covered the area exhaustively, checking every place someone might have fallen or been trapped. Animal attack? Possible, certainly. Bears and mountain lions inhabited the region, but attacks usually left evidence. Blood, torn clothing, drag marks. And the scene at the cabin suggested Claire had left voluntarily, peacefully, intending to return. That left the inexplicable. The category that law enforcement preferred not to discuss, but couldn't entirely dismiss. The wilderness held secrets, ancient patterns that human logic couldn't always decode. People disappeared sometimes, and the forest kept them. As winter deepened and snow measured in feet rather than inches buried the search area, the investigation entered a dormant phase. Claire Holloway's face appeared on missing person posters throughout western Montana and neighboring states. Her story circulated in outdoor recreation communities, prompts of caution. The cabin remained locked and silent, holding its secrets. But the mystery didn't sleep. It waited, like something patient in the darkness, knowing that truth has a way of surfacing eventually, no matter how deeply it's been buried. Emma Holloway refused to leave Montana. She rented a room in Prospect, spent her days hiking the accessible trails, showing Claire's photo to anyone who'd look, asking questions that most people couldn't answer. She became a familiar figure in town, the woman searching for her missing sister, driven by a certainty that Claire was still out there somehow, waiting to be found. Some people admired her determination. Others found it unsettling, a reminder of how easily someone could vanish, how thin the boundary was between presence and absence. Winter passed slowly in the Bitterroot Range. The forest slept beneath its white blanket, silent and patient. And in that silence, something waited. Something that knew exactly where Claire Holloway had gone. Spring came late to Montana in 2019. The snowpack lingered through April, melting slowly, feeding the creeks until they ran high and fast with runoff. By early May, the logging road to Douglas Kern's cabin had finally dried enough to be passable again, and Detective Lindquist organized a follow-up search of the area. She'd spent the winter reviewing the case file obsessively, consulting with wildlife biologists, tracking experts, even a forensic anthropologist from the university who specialized in wilderness disappearances. None of them could provide definitive answers, but they'd all agreed on one thing. When the snow melted, it might reveal what winter had hidden. The team that returned to the cabin that spring was smaller than the initial search party, just Lindquist, Deputy Ortiz, 2 experienced trackers, and Emma Holloway, who'd insisted on being present despite official protests. The cabin looked exactly as they'd left it. The yellow police tape faded but intact, the interior preserved in that eerie stillness of abandonment. Lindquist had arranged for the property to be maintained as evidence, and Kern had reluctantly agreed not to rent it again until the case was resolved. Looking at it now, with wildflowers beginning to bloom in the clearing and birds calling from the trees, it was hard to reconcile the peaceful scene with the mystery at its center. "We start with the areas that were snow-covered last fall," Lindquist explained to the group, spreading a map across the hood of her vehicle. "The ravines, the north-facing slopes, anywhere the accumulation would have prevented thorough searching. We're looking for anything, personal effects, remains, evidence of a campsite, anything that might tell us where she went or what happened." The trackers, a husband and wife team named Joel and Patricia Redding, who'd worked search and rescue for 20 years, moved through the forest with practiced efficiency. They read the landscape the way most people read text, seeing stories in bent grass and disturbed soil, in the way branches had broken and bark had been scarred. Within an hour, Joel called the others over to a steep ravine about 3/4 of a mile northeast of the cabin. "You're going to want to see this," he said, his voice carefully neutral in that way people use when they're trying not to jump to conclusions. At the bottom of the ravine, partially concealed by fallen logs and new growth, was a backpack. Weathered, stained by months of exposure, but unmistakably the same pack Claire had been carrying in the photos her sister provided. Emma made a sound, half gasp, half sob, and started down the slope before Lindquist caught her arm. "Let us process it first," Lindquist said gently. "I know this is hard, but we need to do this right." The pack was photographed in place, then carefully retrieved and examined. It contained a water bottle, energy bars, a first aid kit, and most significantly a second notebook, smaller than the journal in the cabin, spiral-bound with a waterproof cover. The contents had survived the winter relatively intact, and what they revealed sent the investigation in an entirely new direction. The notebook appeared to be field observations, technical notes Claire had been making about wildlife behavior in the area. The early entries were professional, clinical, camera settings, light conditions, species identification. But as the dates progressed toward mid-October, the entries became more detailed, more focused, and notably more concerned with a single subject. October 10th. Large canid tracks near creek, possibly wolf, but size inconsistent with known regional populations. Stride length suggests animal moving at unusual gait. October 12th, same tracks reappearing in different locations. Pattern doesn't match typical territorial behavior. Almost seems like deliberate patrol rather than hunting foraging movement. October 13th, heard vocalization last night, unlike anything in my reference library. Not wolf, not coyote, lower frequency, almost subvocal. Felt it as much as heard it. October 14th, getting clear sense of being observed during daytime photography sessions. Multiple instances of branches breaking in peripheral vision, but nothing visible when I turn. Wildlife in area noticeably absent. No bird calls, no small mammals. Predator nearby, something apex. The entries continued, becoming progressively more specific and more unsettling. Claire had been documenting something, tracking it with the same methodical attention she'd give to any wildlife subject. But her observations described an animal that didn't quite fit known classifications. Something that moved through the forest with intelligence and purpose. Something that seemed aware of her presence, and perhaps deliberately staying just outside clear view. The final entry in the small notebook was dated October 15th, the same day her cabin journal had ended. It came close to the cabin last night. I could hear it circling, testing the perimeter. Heavy steps, bipedal gait confirmed. Breathing audible through the walls. I stayed inside, lights off, waiting for dawn. In the morning, found impressions in the soft ground by the back window. Hands, not paws. 5 digits, opposed thumb structure, but too large, too wrong. I need to get better documentation, need to see it clearly. If I can photograph it, prove what's out here. Tonight, I'm setting up motion-triggered cameras on the trails. Whatever this is, I'm going to get proof. Patricia Redding, reading over Lindquist's shoulder, spoke quietly. She went out there deliberately. She was hunting it. Or it was hunting her, Deputy Ortiz countered, and she decided to confront it instead of leaving. Emma was holding the notebook with shaking hands, tears streaming down her face. That's exactly what she'd do. If she thought she'd found something unknown, something scientifically significant. God, Claire, why didn't you just leave? The discovery of the backpack raised more questions than it answered. How had it ended up in the ravine? Had Claire dropped it while fleeing? Had she hidden it there intentionally, or had something else moved it? The location was off the direct path the dogs had tracked the previous fall, suggesting either Claire had wandered more extensively than initially thought, or the evidence had been displaced after her disappearance. Over the next week, the search team scoured the surrounding area with renewed intensity. They found 3 of Claire's motion-triggered cameras, exactly as she'd described, set up along game trails within a half-mile radius of the cabin. The cameras were designed to activate when movement triggered their sensors, capturing whatever passed by. Lindquist had them collected as evidence, sent to a forensic lab in Missoula to retrieve any footage that might have survived the winter. The results, when they came back, were both illuminating and deeply disturbing. 2 of the cameras had malfunctioned or been damaged by weather, their memory cards corrupted beyond recovery. But the 3rd camera, positioned on a trail leading toward the clearing where the dogs had refused to go, had captured 47 images over a 3-day period in mid-October. Most showed nothing unusual: deer passing at dawn, a fox pausing to sniff the air, tree branches moving in wind. But 6 images, all captured on the night of October 15th between 10 p.m. and midnight, showed something else. The first image, movement at the edge of the frame, too blurred to distinguish clearly, but suggesting something large passing through the camera's field of view. The second image, a shape among the trees, dark against darkness, roughly humanoid in silhouette, but wrong in proportion. Too tall, limbs too long, posture bent forward in a way that suggested power rather than deformity. The third through fifth images, progressively clearer shots of something approaching the camera, head lowered as if examining it, partially obscured by branches, but showing enough detail to make identification maddeningly elusive. Dark fur or hair covering the visible portions, what might be a hand reaching toward the lens, fingers spread, the proportions distinctly not human but not clearly animal either. The sixth image, complete darkness, as if something had covered the lens or knocked the camera offline. No further images were captured after that. When the search team found the camera, it was still mounted on its tree, still functional, but its angle had been shifted downward, pointing at the ground instead of the trail, deliberately moved. Lindquist arranged for the images to be analyzed by multiple experts, wildlife biologists, zoologists, a digital forensics specialist to confirm they hadn't been tampered with. The responses ranged from puzzled to dismissive. Could be a bear standing upright, one biologist suggested. The perspective and low light make size estimates unreliable. Another pointed out that motion-triggered cameras often captured ambiguous images, especially at night, and human pattern recognition tended to see familiar shapes where none existed. "We see what we expect to see," he explained. "Someone looking for mystery finds mystery." But Dr. Catherine Merrill, a wildlife biologist who'd spent 30 years studying predator behavior in the northern Rockies, had a different reaction. She studied the images for a long time in silence before speaking. "I can't tell you what this is," she said finally, "but I can tell you what it's not. It's not a bear. The body structure is wrong. The movement pattern. It's not a known primate. There are no indigenous primates of this size in North America. It's not a person in a costume. The gait suggests genuine quadrupedal to bipedal flexibility that humans can't replicate convincingly." She looked at Lindquist directly. Whatever your photographer was tracking, she was right that it was unusual. Whether that means unknown species, misidentified known species, or something else entirely, I can't say. But she was documenting something real. The revelation that Claire had been actively pursuing an unidentified animal shifted the investigation's focus. It suggested intentional risk-taking, a decision to engage with potential danger rather than retreat from it. It made her disappearance less random, more the result of specific choices made in pursuit of documentation. But it also raised uncomfortable questions about what exactly she'd been pursuing and whether it had ultimately pursued her back. Sheriff Gallagher, reviewing the new evidence, expressed frustration with the ambiguity. "We're law enforcement, not cryptozoologists," he told Lindquist during a case conference. "I need concrete evidence I can act on. What am I supposed to put in a report? Possible unidentified animal in the area. That doesn't help us find Claire Holloway or determine what happened to her." "But it explains her behavior," Lindquist countered. "It explains why she stayed when most people would have left, why she went into the forest that night instead of staying secure in the cabin. She thought she was on the verge of a major discovery. She was willing to take risks for it. And maybe those risks killed her." "Maybe," Lindquist agreed. "But where's the body? Where's the evidence of an attack? If some animal killed her, there should be remains. We should have found something by now." The search continued through May and into early June, teams covering ground that had been inaccessible during winter. They found more ambiguous evidence, scratch marks on trees at heights that suggested something very tall had been marking territory, scat that couldn't be definitively identified, areas where vegetation had been disturbed in patterns that suggested a large animal bedding down, but no human remains. No definitive proof of what had happened to Claire Holloway. Emma spent those weeks in a state of suspended agony, caught between hope that Claire might still be alive somewhere and the growing certainty that her sister was gone. She hiked the trails obsessively, often alone despite warnings from law enforcement, carrying copies of the camera images and showing them to anyone who'd look. Most locals were skeptical or dismissive, but a few, particularly older residents who'd spent lifetimes in these mountains, looked at the images with recognition. One man, a retired logger named Henry Tibbs, who'd worked these forests for 40 years, pulled Emma aside outside the general store in Prospect. "Your sister," he said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. She was looking for the tall ones, wasn't she? Emma felt her pulse quicken. "The tall ones?" Tibbs nodded slowly. "We don't talk about them much. Not to outsiders, not usually even to each other. But they're out there. Always have been. Native folks knew about them, had names for them in languages most people don't speak anymore. Forest guardians, some called them. Others had less friendly names." He looked at the images Emma was holding, his weathered face troubled. "You see something like that, you're supposed to look away, pretend you didn't see. They don't like being watched, don't like being studied. Your sister, she did the opposite, didn't she? She looked right at them." "Do you know what they are?" Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Tibbs shook his head. "Not what they are. Just that they're here, in the deep places, and have been longer than we have. Most of the time, they stay away from people. But sometimes, when someone gets too curious, sees too much—" He didn't finish the sentence. "I'm sorry about your sister. I truly am. But she went looking for something that doesn't want to be found. These conversations, these fragments of local folklore and whispered warnings didn't make it into official reports. They existed in the margins of the investigation, unverifiable and unactionable. But they created a narrative framework that was hard to ignore. The idea that Claire had crossed some invisible boundary, violated some unspoken rule, and paid a price for it. Detective Lindquist found herself caught between professional skepticism and instinctive unease. She'd worked dozens of cases, seen the worst of human behavior, dealt with evidence both clear and ambiguous, but this case resisted classification. Every rational explanation had problems. Every piece of evidence pointed in multiple directions simultaneously, and the deeper she dug, the more she felt like she was approaching something that didn't want to be approached. In late June, she made a decision that surprised even herself. She contacted Dr. Marcus Chen, an anthropologist from Portland State University who specialized in wilderness folklore and allegedly paranormal phenomena. Chen approached such subjects from an academic perspective, treating them as cultural phenomena worthy of serious study without necessarily endorsing supernatural explanations. He'd published papers on Sasquatch sightings in the Pacific Northwest, analyzing them as sociological data rather than zoological evidence. Chen drove to Montana, reviewed the case file, interviewed witnesses, and spent 3 days hiking the area around the cabin with Lindquist as a guide. His conclusion, delivered over coffee in a Prospect diner, was characteristically nuanced. "You have a genuine mystery here," he said. "Whether it's a mystery of zoology, psychology, or something else is unclear. But the evidence suggests Claire Holloway encountered something in those woods that defied her understanding. The pattern of her observations, the progression from curiosity to concern to active investigation, that's consistent with someone documenting a genuinely anomalous phenomenon." "But what phenomenon?" Lindquist pressed. "What are we actually talking about here?" Chen chose his words carefully. "The indigenous peoples of this region have oral traditions going back centuries about beings that inhabit the deep forest, creatures that exist in the boundary between animal and something more. Whether those traditions reflect actual biological entities, cultural metaphors, or psychological projection is debatable. but the consistency of the accounts across different cultures and time periods suggests something was being observed and interpreted through available frameworks. He paused, sipping his coffee. In modern times, we call them various names depending on the region: Sasquatch, Bigfoot, wood apes. The terminology varies, but the core description remains remarkably consistent: large, bipedal, intelligent, elusive, and primarily interested in avoiding human contact. "You're saying Claire found Bigfoot," Lindquist said flatly. "That's what you're suggesting." "I'm saying she found something she couldn't explain using conventional categories," Chen corrected. "Whether that something fits into undiscovered primate species, misidentified known animals, or human imagination, I can't determine from available evidence. But her documentation suggests she believed it was real and scientifically significant. And given her expertise and experience, that belief warrants consideration." The conversation left Lindquist more unsettled than before. She'd wanted clarity, definitive answers that would let her close the case or at least establish clear next steps. Instead, she had academic validation of the mystery itself, confirmation that something strange had occurred, but no clearer understanding of what. As summer deepened, the active search operations ceased once again. The official status remained missing person, ongoing investigation, but resources were allocated elsewhere. Emma Holloway finally returned to Oregon, emotionally exhausted, no closer to answers than she'd been 9 months earlier. She'd spent everything she had, financially, emotionally, on the search, and it had yielded only fragments and ambiguities. Before leaving, she met with Lindquist one final time. "Promise me you won't give up," Emma said, gripping the detective's hands. "I know everyone else is moving on, treating this like just another cold case, but Claire deserves better. She deserves to be found, or at least to have the truth known." Lindquist promised, though she wasn't sure what more she could do. The case haunted her dreams, filled her off hours with speculation and dead-end research. She created a network of contacts: wildlife experts, anthropologists, other law enforcement officers who'd handled unusual wilderness disappearances. She collected similar cases from across the Pacific Northwest and Northern Rockies, looking for patterns, and she found them. Over the past 50 years, dozens of people had vanished in remote forest areas under circumstances that defied easy explanation. Not all of them showed the same elements as Claire's case, but enough did to suggest a pattern worth investigating. Most disturbing were the cases where evidence suggested the missing person had been aware of something in the forest before they disappeared. Journal entries about being watched, reports to friends about unusual animal behavior, photographs showing ambiguous shapes in the background. It was as if they'd become aware of something hidden in the wilderness and then been swallowed by it, absorbed back into the forest that had revealed too much. In August, Douglas Kern called Lindquist with disturbing news. He'd been checking his properties in preparation for fall hunting season, and when he visited the cabin, he found signs of intrusion. The door was still locked, the police tape intact, but inside, things had been moved. The journal on the table had been opened to a different page. Claire's camera equipment had been rearranged, and on the wooden floor, tracked in from outside, were muddy prints, the same unusual prints they'd found the previous October. "Something's been inside," Kern told Lindquist, his voice tight with barely controlled fear. "Since the last time anyone was there officially, something unlocked the door or got in some other way and moved her things around. Like it was looking for something or leaving a message." Lindquist drove out immediately, bringing Deputy Ortiz and a forensics team. The scene was exactly as Kern had described. No signs of forced entry, no broken windows, but clear evidence that the interior had been disturbed. The prints on the floor were photographed, measured, compared to the previous findings. Identical in size and structure, pressed into dried mud, that analysis suggested was less than a week old. The implications were staggering. Either someone, human, was accessing the secured crime scene for unknown purposes, or something else was. Something that had hands capable of turning a doorknob, intelligence enough to understand locks, and motivation to return to the place where Claire had last been seen. "We need to set up surveillance," Ortiz suggested. "Cameras, motion sensors, maybe even someone posted here overnight. If something's coming back, we need to catch it in the act." Lindquist agreed, though she felt a deep reluctance she couldn't fully articulate. Part of her didn't want to know what might appear on those surveillance feeds, didn't want to confirm that something impossible was real. But the investigator in her, the part that needed answers regardless of comfort, won out. They installed 4 high-resolution cameras with night vision capabilities, positioned to cover all approaches to the cabin. Motion sensors were placed on the doors and windows. A recording system in a locked, weatherproof box documented everything continuously. Then they withdrew and waited. For 2 weeks, the cameras recorded nothing but wildlife. Deer browsing near the cabin, a black bear investigating the porch, ravens and jays flitting through the frame. Normal forest activity. Lindquist began to think whatever had been there wouldn't return, that perhaps the increased law enforcement presence had scared it off. Then on the 15th night, the motion sensors triggered at 2:47 a.m. The footage, reviewed the next morning in stunned silence, showed something approaching the cabin from the forest. The quality was excellent, the night vision rendering everything in sharp clarity. What it captured defied easy explanation. The figure moved on 2 legs, tall. The camera's reference point suggested at least 7 feet, possibly taller. Its body was covered in dark hair or fur, moving with each step in a way that proved it wasn't clothing. The build was massive, powerful, with broad shoulders and long arms that suggested immense strength. But it was the movement that was most unsettling. Fluid, purposeful, intelligent. This wasn't an animal wandering through its territory. This was a being approaching a specific destination with clear intent. It circled the cabin slowly, pausing at the windows to peer inside, reaching out occasionally to touch the walls with what the camera clearly showed were hands. 5 digits, opposed thumbs, but proportioned and structured, unlike human hands. At one point, it approached the door directly, face turned toward the camera above it. The image, frozen and enhanced later, would become the subject of intense analysis and debate. The face was distinctly non-human, but also not clearly animal, a blend of features that suggested something in between, or perhaps something entirely separate from both categories. After several minutes, the figure moved to the back of the cabin, out of direct camera view. The motion sensors indicated it remained there for approximately 20 minutes before departing back into the forest, moving quickly and disappearing from range within seconds. The footage was explosive, potentially the clearest documentation ever captured of what people had been reporting for decades. But it also raised profound questions. Was this what Claire had been tracking? Had it returned looking for her, or looking for the evidence she'd gathered? And most chillingly, was it still out there, watching, waiting? Could this evidence finally solve the mystery of Claire Holloway's disappearance? Or had it just deepened the enigma beyond hope of resolution? The surveillance footage created a firestorm that extended far beyond the investigation itself. Within days of its discovery, despite efforts to maintain operational security, the images had leaked, first to local news, then regional outlets, and finally to national media and internet forums dedicated to unexplained phenomena. The clear, high-quality night vision capture of something massive and bipedal examining Claire Holloway's cabin became one of the most analyzed pieces of footage in the history of cryptozoology debates. Detective Lindquist found herself at the center of unwanted attention. Reporters camped outside the sheriff's office in Prospect. Documentary crews requested interviews. Self-proclaimed experts arrived from across the country, demanding access to the investigation files and the cabin itself. Sheriff Gallagher, facing pressure from multiple directions, made the decision to bring in outside analysis while trying to maintain some control over the circus the case had become. The FBI field office in Salt Lake City sent 2 agents to review the evidence, more as a courtesy than because they believed federal jurisdiction applied. Agent Victoria Cross, a veteran investigator with a reputation for methodical thoroughness, spent a week in Montana examining every aspect of the case. Her preliminary report, completed in September 2019, was carefully worded but ultimately inconclusive. The footage shows an unidentified figure of unusual size and appearance, Cross wrote. Digital analysis confirms the images have not been artificially manipulated or enhanced beyond standard night vision processing. Whatever was captured on camera was physically present at that location. However, identification of the subject remains impossible based on available footage. The possibility of an elaborate hoax using costume and prosthetics cannot be entirely eliminated, though such a hoax would require considerable resources and technical sophistication. In other words, we don't know what this is, but we can't prove it's impossible. The scientific community was similarly divided. Dr. Merrill, the wildlife biologist who'd examined the earlier trail camera images, reviewed the surveillance footage with a mixture of fascination and professional caution. If this is genuine, and I believe it is, then we're looking at something that challenges our understanding of North American megafauna, she told Lindquist during a consultation. The biomechanics alone are extraordinary. The way it moves suggests adaptations we don't see in any known primate, but without physical evidence, hair samples, scat, skeletal remains, we can't make definitive claims about what species we're observing. What about Claire? Lindquist asked. If this thing was in the area when she disappeared, is it reasonable to assume there's a connection? Merrill considered the question carefully. If we're dealing with an unknown primate species, they're typically shy and avoidant of humans. Aggression would be unusual unless the animal felt threatened or was protecting territory, but she hesitated. The behavior shown in your footage, approaching a human structure, investigating it deliberately, that suggests unusual boldness. Possibly curiosity, possibly something else. The something else hung in the air, unspoken but understood. The footage showed the figure not just approaching the cabin, but examining it with what appeared to be intelligent curiosity, touching the walls, peering through windows, testing the door. That wasn't animal behavior in any conventional sense. It suggested awareness, purpose, perhaps even understanding of what the structure was and what it represented. As fall arrived and the investigation approached its first anniversary, Lindquist made a controversial decision. She organized an overnight observation at the cabin, hoping the presence of people might trigger another appearance by whatever had been captured on camera. Sheriff Gallagher was skeptical. What are we hoping to accomplish? An introduction, but agreed to provide resources for what was framed as a surveillance operation. The team consisted of Lindquist, Deputy Ortiz, Dr. Merrill, and 2 wildlife officers from Montana, Fish, Wildlife and Parks. They arrived at the cabin in late afternoon, set up additional recording equipment, and prepared to maintain watch through the night. The plan was simple: observe, document, do not engage. If the figure appeared, they would record everything from multiple angles and maintain a safe distance. No one was to approach or attempt contact. The evening passed quietly. The forest around them settled into its nocturnal rhythms, owls calling, small animals rustling through undergrowth, the distant sound of the creek running over stones. Inside the cabin, lit by low red lights that wouldn't destroy their night vision, the team took turns monitoring the camera feeds and maintaining watch through the windows. At 11:42 p.m., Dr. Merrill, who was watching the northeast approach, stiffened and raised her hand for silence. "Movement," she whispered. "Something large, approximately 60 yards out, moving parallel to the cabin." Everyone moved to positions, cameras ready, hearts racing. Through the night vision scopes, they could see it, a massive shape moving through the trees with surprising stealth. It didn't approach directly, but circled the cabin at distance, as if aware of the increased human presence and maintaining caution. For nearly 20 minutes, it moved through the forest, occasionally visible between trees, never fully exposed. Then it stopped. The shape stood motionless, perhaps 50 yards from the cabin, and even through the distortion of night vision technology, they could feel it watching them. The sensation was overwhelming, the absolute certainty that something intelligent was out there, studying them with the same intensity they were using to study it. The moment stretched, taut with tension, until finally the figure turned and moved away, disappearing into the deeper forest with a speed that seemed impossible for something so large. No one spoke for several minutes after it vanished. Deputy Ortiz was shaking slightly, her professional composure cracked by the experience. "That was real," she said finally, unnecessarily. "That was actually real." Dr. Merrill was reviewing the footage on her camera, her hands surprisingly steady. "We got it," she confirmed. "Not as clear as the surveillance footage, but definitive evidence of a large bipedal creature in the area. This is extraordinary." But Lindquist was thinking about something else. The figure had maintained distance, had been cautious, aware. It knew they were there. It had chosen not to approach closely. Was that fear, caution, or had it simply learned that the cabin now held multiple humans and adjusted its behavior accordingly? And, most importantly, what had it been doing here when Claire was alone? The overnight observation made headlines, of course. More footage, more evidence, more questions. The small town of Prospect found itself inundated with tourists, curiosity seekers, and hunters who thought bagging an unknown creature would make them famous. The Forest Service closed the area around the cabin to public access, citing safety concerns and ongoing investigation. Private security was hired to patrol the logging road, turning back anyone without official authorization. Meanwhile, Lindquist continued pursuing the human element of the investigation, because regardless of what was in the forest, Claire Holloway was still missing. She expanded her timeline research, tracking Claire's movements in the weeks before she'd come to Montana. Phone records, credit card statements, email correspondence, social media activity, building a complete picture of her life leading up to the disappearance. What emerged was a portrait of someone who'd been increasingly interested in reports of unidentified animals in remote areas. Claire's internet search history showed queries about unusual wildlife sightings in the northern Rockies, forums dedicated to unknown species, academic papers about undiscovered megafauna. She'd been in contact with several researchers who studied such phenomena, asking questions about the best locations and methods for documentation. One email exchange from September 2018 was particularly revealing. Claire had written to Dr. Jeffrey Paulson, a primatologist who'd spent years investigating Sasquatch reports. "I'm tired of capturing common species in common ways. I want to photograph something that matters, something that changes our understanding. If there's even a chance that unidentified primates exist in North America, I need to try to document them. Can you recommend locations with credible recent sightings?" Paulson had responded with a list of areas, and the Bitterroot Range in Montana was among them. Multiple credible reports over the years, he'd written, remote enough that an unknown species could remain concealed, but accessible enough for determined research. If you're serious about this, start there. But be careful. If they exist, they've survived by avoiding humans. They won't appreciate being studied. So Claire had come to Montana deliberately, specifically seeking something unknown. It wasn't coincidence. She'd chosen that cabin, that location, because she believed it offered the best chance of encountering what she was looking for. And apparently she'd been right. But what happened after the encounter? That was still the central mystery. In November 2019, as the investigation approached 13 months, Lindquist received a call from a park ranger named Thomas Whitaker, who worked in the Bob Marshall Wilderness, about 80 miles north of the cabin. Whitaker had been following the case and had information he thought might be relevant. "I probably should have come forward sooner," Whitaker admitted when they met at a ranger station. "But I wasn't sure it connected, and I didn't want to waste your time or sound crazy. But after seeing that surveillance footage, I think I saw her, saw Claire Holloway, or someone who looked like her." Lindquist felt her pulse quicken. "When? Where?" "Late October last year, October 28th to be specific. I was doing a backcountry patrol, checking on some campsites in the wilderness area. There's a network of old cabins back there, historic structures from the homesteading era that the Forest Service maintains. I was checking one that hadn't been visited in months, and I found evidence someone had been staying there recently. Fireplace had been used, some food wrappers in the trash, a sleeping bag laid out." He pulled out his phone, showed Lindquist photos he'd taken of the site. "I didn't think much of it. Sometimes hikers use the cabins, even though they're not supposed to. But I took these photos for documentation. The images showed a rustic one-room cabin, similar to but more primitive than Kern's rental property. The interior was sparse, but showed clear signs of recent occupation. And there, on a wooden shelf above the fireplace, barely visible in the background of one photo, was something that made Lindquist's breath catch. A camera. It looked identical to the model Claire had been using. "Did you see whoever was staying there?" Lindquist asked urgently. Whitaker shook his head. "No, but I found tracks leading away from the cabin, heading deeper into the wilderness. They looked fresh, like whoever it was had left that morning or maybe the day before. I followed them for a while, but they led into really rough terrain, and I lost the trail. I filed a report about unauthorized cabin use, but—" He shrugged. "It happens. I didn't think it was significant." "We need to get back to that cabin," Lindquist said immediately. "Now, today, if possible." But Whitaker's expression was apologetic. "That's the problem. The cabin's in deep backcountry, accessible only by hiking or horseback, and it's November. Snow's already accumulating at that elevation. We won't be able to reach it again until spring at the earliest. Another winter of waiting, another season of preservation and patience, while the forest kept its secrets locked beneath snow." Lindquist wanted to scream with frustration, but she forced herself to think professionally. "Can you mark the exact location on a map? And I'll need copies of all your photos, your patrol report, everything." Over the following weeks, she analyzed every pixel of Whitaker's photographs, looking for anything that might confirm Claire's presence at that remote cabin. The camera on the shelf was the right model, the right color, but without recovering it, there was no way to be certain it was Claire's. Still, the timing was compelling. October 28th, 13 days after Claire's disappearance from Kern's cabin. If she'd somehow survived, made her way deeper into the wilderness, taken shelter in a historic structure, it was possible, barely possible, but not impossible. But why? Why flee into the wilderness instead of returning to civilization? Why hide in a remote cabin rather than seeking help? Unless she wasn't fleeing toward anything, unless she was fleeing from something. Emma, when Lindquist called her with the update, responded with desperate hope. "She's alive. She could still be alive." "We don't know for certain it was her," Lindquist cautioned, "but it's a lead worth pursuing. In spring, we'll mount an expedition to that cabin and conduct a thorough search of the area." The winter of 2019-2020 was particularly harsh. Snow fell heavily throughout the northern Rockies, temperatures plunged, and the backcountry became impassable for months. Lindquist used the time to prepare, assembling a team, coordinating with the Forest Service, planning the logistics of a comprehensive search operation in remote wilderness. She also continued researching similar cases, finding disturbing patterns. At least 8 other disappearances in the Pacific Northwest and Northern Rockies over the past 20 years showed similar elements: experienced outdoors people vanishing in remote areas, limited evidence at the scene, reports of unusual animal activity beforehand, and in a few cases, brief sightings by others who claimed the missing person had survived but was living in hiding. In most cases, the individuals were never found. In 2 cases, remains were eventually discovered years later, showing signs of exposure and deprivation, but no clear cause of death. One case in particular caught Lindquist's attention. In 2007, a wildlife biologist named Marcus Chen, no relation to the anthropologist she'd consulted, had disappeared in the Cascade Range of Washington. Chen had been studying reported Sasquatch sightings as part of an independent research project. His camp was found abandoned, equipment left behind, but Chen himself had vanished. 4 months later, a hiker reported encountering a man matching Chen's description in a remote valley, living in a makeshift shelter. The hiker tried to approach, but the man fled into the forest. Search teams investigated but found no trace. Chen was never seen again, officially declared dead in 2014. Was it possible that encounters with something unknown in the wilderness caused some people to retreat? To abandon their normal lives and disappear into the forest by choice? The psychology of it didn't quite make sense. But then again, who could predict how someone would react to confronting something that fundamentally challenged their understanding of reality? As spring 2020 approached, the world was disrupted by COVID-19. The pandemic complicated everything. Travel restrictions, resource allocation, shifted law enforcement priorities. The planned expedition to the backcountry cabin was delayed, then delayed again. By the time conditions allowed for the operation, it was already summer, nearly 2 years since Claire's disappearance. In July 2020, a team consisting of Lindquist, Deputy Ortiz, Ranger Whitaker, and 6 experienced wilderness search and rescue personnel finally made the trek to the remote cabin Whitaker had documented. The journey took 2 days on horseback, following narrow trails through dense forest and across high mountain passes. The wilderness area was vast, untouched, the kind of place where you could truly disappear if you wanted to. The cabin, when they reached it, looked exactly as it had in Whitaker's photos, a weathered structure of hand-hewn logs, probably a century old, maintained by the Forest Service as a historical site. The door was closed, but not locked, the interior dim and musty. And it was clear that someone had been there, though whether recently or 2 years ago was impossible to immediately determine. The camera was still on the shelf. Lindquist approached it slowly, almost afraid to confirm what she suspected. It was a Nikon, the same model Claire owned. She photographed it in place, then carefully retrieved it, checking the serial number against the list from Claire's equipment. A match. Definitive. This was Claire's camera. She was here, Ortiz breathed. She actually made it this far. The cabin was thoroughly searched. They found more evidence of occupation, a sleeping bag in the corner, several empty food containers, a small stash of supplies that looked like they'd been gathered from various sources, a water bottle that matched the brand Claire favored, and on the walls, barely visible in the dim light, scratches that might have been tally marks. Someone keeping track of days. But no Claire, and no indication of where she'd gone from here. The search expanded from the cabin, teams radiating outward in careful patterns, looking for trails, campsites, any sign of continued occupation. They found several spots that might have been used as temporary shelters, lean-tos constructed from branches, fire rings with old ash, areas where ground vegetation had been disturbed. But dating them was impossible, and there was no way to confirm they were connected to Claire rather than other wilderness travelers over the years. What they didn't find were any signs of the creatures that had been documented near the original cabin. No unusual tracks, no evidence of anything beyond normal wildlife. It was as if this deeper wilderness was different territory, or perhaps whatever had been present at the first location didn't range this far. After a week of searching, the team had to withdraw. They'd found enough to confirm Claire had reached the cabin, had survived at least 13 days after her disappearance. But beyond that, The trail went cold. She could have traveled in any direction from here, could have succumbed to the elements, could still be somewhere in the vast wilderness, or could have made her way out through some other route and deliberately chosen not to resurface. It's like she became part of the forest, Ortiz said, on the ride back to civilization. Absorbed into it, gone wild. Lindquist didn't respond, but the phrase haunted her. Gone wild. It suggested a kind of transformation, a rejection of civilization for something more primal. But was that what had happened? Or was Claire still running, still hiding, still afraid of whatever she'd encountered at that first cabin? The case entered a strange, suspended state after that, officially ongoing but practically stalled. The evidence proved Claire had survived the initial disappearance, had made it deep into the wilderness, had sheltered in a remote cabin, but then nothing. The trail ended there, lost in millions of acres of forest. Without new evidence, there was nowhere else to look. Years passed. The investigation remained open but inactive. Lindquist moved on to other cases but never forgot Claire Holloway. Emma, devastated by the near miss of finding her sister, eventually had to accept that some questions might never be answered. The surveillance footage from the cabin became the subject of ongoing debate in cryptozoology circles, but mainstream science remained skeptical. And then, in October 2023, 5 years almost to the day after Claire's disappearance, a hunting guide named Robert Kincaid was leading clients through a remote section of the Bitterroot Range, miles from any maintained trail, when he stumbled across something that would break the case open in the most unexpected way. Another cabin, one that wasn't on any map, wasn't part of any Forest Service inventory. A structure that looked like it had been built recently, from materials salvaged and scavenged. And when Kincaid approached cautiously, he saw smoke rising from the chimney. The fireplace was warm. Someone was living there. After 5 years somehow, impossibly, Claire Holloway had been found. But the woman they found wasn't quite the same person who'd disappeared. Robert Kincaid had been guiding hunters in Montana for 15 years. He knew the Bitterroot Range better than most, knew where the elk gathered in autumn, where to find the game trails that led to the best vantage points. But on October 17, 2023, following a route he'd never taken before because his clients wanted to explore truly remote territory, he found himself in a section of forest so deep and untouched that even he felt the weight of its isolation. The cabin appeared suddenly, almost hidden beneath the overhang of massive lodgepole pines. It was small, maybe 12 feet square, built from weathered logs that looked salvaged from fallen trees. The construction was crude but functional, and most startlingly, smoke was rising from a stone chimney cobbled together from river rocks. Someone was inside. Someone was living here, miles from the nearest trail, in wilderness that saw perhaps a handful of visitors per year. Kincaid signaled his clients to wait, approached cautiously. "Hello?" he called. "Anyone home? We're just passing through, don't mean any trouble." No response, but he could hear movement inside, the sound of someone shifting position. He called out again, louder this time, identifying himself as a licensed guide. Still nothing. He was about to retreat, respecting whoever's solitude this was, when the door opened slowly. The woman who emerged was thin, weathered, with sun-darkened skin and auburn hair grown long and tied back with what looked like strips of leather. She wore layers of mismatched clothing, a thermal shirt, a canvas jacket that might once have been tan but was now stained and patched, pants that had been repaired multiple times with rough stitching. Her feet were wrapped in makeshift boots constructed from animal hide and paracord. She looked like she'd been living off the land for a long time, but her eyes, sharp, alert, intelligent, held recognition when she saw the modern equipment Kincaid and his clients were carrying. "I know who you are," she said, her voice rough from disuse, "or what you represent, civilization. I wondered when someone would find this place." Kincaid studied her face, something nagging at his memory. "Are you Are you out here by choice? Do you need help, medical attention? The woman's expression was complicated. Fear, resignation, something like relief, all mixed together. I don't know how to answer that. She glanced past him at the hunters waiting in the trees. How many of you are there? 3 total. We're just hunting elk. Didn't expect to find anyone out here. He took a step closer, keeping his body language non-threatening. Ma'am, if you're in some kind of trouble, if someone hurt you or you're hiding from something, we can help. We have satellite phones. We can call for assistance. She laughed, but it was a brittle sound. You can't help with what I'm hiding from. No one can. Then she seemed to make a decision, squaring her shoulders. My name is Claire Holloway. I disappeared 5 years ago from a cabin about 15 miles southwest of here. I expect there are people who've been looking for me. The name hit Kincaid like a physical blow. He'd heard about the case, of course. Everyone in Montana who spent time in the wilderness knew about the photographer who'd vanished, about the strange evidence and the surveillance footage of something unidentified. Jesus, he breathed. You're her. You're really her. I'm what's left of her, Claire said quietly. Within hours, the remote cabin was swarming with law enforcement, search and rescue personnel, and medical teams that had been helicoptered in. Detective Lindquist, pulled from another investigation in Missoula, arrived by early evening, hardly able to believe the call she'd received. Claire Holloway, alive, found, after 5 years. But the woman sitting in the back of the rescue helicopter, wrapped in emergency blankets and clutching a cup of hot coffee, barely resembled the person in the photos from 2018. She was significantly thinner, her body hardened by years of survival, but also showing signs of malnutrition. Her hands were calloused and scarred. Frost damage had claimed 2 toes on her left foot, but physically, miraculously, she was alive and reasonably healthy given the circumstances. Mentally was another question. She was transported to a hospital in Missoula, kept overnight for observation and medical evaluation. Emma was contacted immediately and took the first flight she could get, arriving the next morning. The reunion between the sisters was emotional, overwhelming, but also strangely muted. Emma sobbed, held Claire, whispered that she'd never given up hope. Claire accepted the embrace, but seemed distant, as if part of her was still in the forest, still watching the tree line. I'm sorry, Claire said finally. I'm so sorry for what I put you through. What happened to you? Emma asked, pulling back to look at her sister's face. Where have you been? Why didn't you come back? Claire's expression shuttered. I can't explain it in a way that makes sense. I'm not sure I understand it myself. Over the following days, as Claire recovered physically and underwent psychological evaluation, the story began to emerge in fragments. Lindquist conducted careful interviews, never pushing too hard, letting Claire control the pace of revelation. What she heard was extraordinary, disturbing, and maddeningly ambiguous. A narrative that could be interpreted as trauma-induced delusion, as objective experience, or as something in between. According to Claire, she had indeed been tracking an unidentified creature in the weeks before her disappearance. Her documentation had been meticulous, scientific, but also increasingly concerned as the animal, and she insisted on calling it an animal, not a monster or a being, had begun displaying interest in her rather than avoiding her presence. They're intelligent, Claire explained during one interview, her voice steady, but her eyes distant. More intelligent than we give them credit for. They understand tools, structures, human behavior. The one that was near my cabin, it was young, I think. Curious. It watched me for days before I even knew it was there, learning my patterns, figuring out if I was a threat. But something changed, Lindquist prompted gently. On October 15th, you wrote that you were going to try to get photographic evidence. Claire nodded slowly. I set up the trail cameras, and then that night, I waited outside. I wanted to see it clearly, to document it properly, and I did. It came close, closer than it ever had before. It was She paused, searching for words. Magnificent, frightening, wrong in ways I couldn't articulate, but also just an animal trying to survive in a world that's increasingly hostile to anything that doesn't fit human categories. What happened then? Claire's hands tightened around her coffee cup. There were others. I didn't realize until that night, but there were others in the area, older, larger, and they weren't curious. They were territorial. The young one had violated some rule by getting so close to human habitation, and they came to correct it. I heard them calling to each other, these vocalizations that you feel in your bones, and I realized I was in the middle of something I didn't understand, something dangerous. She described fleeing into the cabin, extinguishing the lights, waiting in the darkness, while sounds surrounded the structure. Heavy footfalls, something testing the walls, breathing that was too deep, too powerful to be human. They didn't try to break in, she said. They could have. They were strong enough, but they just investigated, like they were trying to understand what I was, why I was there. When dawn came, she'd found massive prints all around the cabin, scratch marks on the walls and door, evidence of a prolonged presence. I knew I had to leave. Not just the cabin, the whole area. They knew where I was now, and I didn't know what they'd do if I stayed. Whether they'd see me as a threat or just a curiosity, either way, I couldn't risk it. But instead of hiking back to civilization, back to her car and safety, Claire had gone deeper into the wilderness. This was the part that Lindquist struggled to understand, the decision that seemed to defy logic. Why? She asked. Why not just drive away? Claire met her eyes with an intensity that was almost painful. Because I'd seen them, really seen them, not just glimpses or shadows. I'd documented them, photographed them, proved they existed. And I knew what would happen if I came back with that evidence. Expeditions, hunters, scientists, media. These mountains would be overrun with people trying to find them, capture them, kill them. They'd be hunted into extinction or captured for study. Either way, they'd be destroyed. So you chose to protect them instead of protecting yourself. I chose not to be responsible for their annihilation, Claire corrected. I destroyed the memory cards from my cameras, all the clear photographs, the detailed documentation. I deleted everything. And then I left, went as deep into the wilderness as I could manage, found that historic cabin, and stayed there until I figured out my next move. But there had been no next move. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. Claire survived using skills she developed over years of wilderness photography, foraging, fishing, building shelters, following animal migrations to food sources. She'd intended it to be temporary, a few weeks or months until the search operations died down, and she could slip back into civilization somewhere far from Montana, start over with a new identity. But the longer I stayed out here, she said softly, the harder it became to imagine going back. I was surviving, I was free, no deadlines, no expectations, no technology or noise or crowds. Just the forest and the seasons and myself. It became easier to stay than to return. Psychiatrists who evaluated her identified signs of trauma, certainly, but also what they termed voluntary simplicity taken to an extreme, a complete withdrawal from society that wasn't quite mental illness, but wasn't quite healthy either. She'd adapted to wilderness living so completely that the prospect of returning to normal life felt more threatening than continued isolation. And they left me alone, Claire added, almost as an afterthought. The creatures. Once I moved deeper into their territory, away from the edges where humans travel, they stopped seeing me as a threat. I'd see them occasionally, always at a distance. They knew I was there, but they also knew I wasn't hunting them or trying to expose them. We coexisted, an understanding. This was the part that some investigators found impossible to accept. The idea that Claire had not only survived 5 years in the wilderness, but had done so while maintaining some kind of peaceful relationship with creatures that might not even exist. The alternative explanation, that isolation and trauma had caused her to create an elaborate rationalization for her choices, that the creatures were hallucinations or misidentified wildlife, seemed more plausible to many. But there were problems with that explanation too. Claire's makeshift cabin, the one where Kincaid had found her, showed evidence of disturbances similar to those at the original rental cabin. Large prints in the surrounding soil, scratch marks on trees at unusual heights, areas where something massive had bedded down, and Claire's descriptions of the creature's behavior, their social structure, their patterns of movement. It was all remarkably consistent, detailed in ways that suggested either genuine observation or an elaborate delusion maintained over years. Physical evidence from Claire's hidden cabin was collected and analyzed. Hair samples found caught on bark near the structure were sent to a genetics lab for analysis. The results were inconclusive. The samples contained DNA that was primarily similar to known bear species, but with unusual markers that didn't match any reference database. Contamination was possible. So was the presence of an unidentified species. The scientists couldn't say definitively. Emma, desperate to understand, spent hours with her sister trying to bridge the 5 years of separation. "Why didn't you at least try to let me know you were alive?" she asked during one tearful conversation. "I thought you were dead, Claire. I grieved for you." Claire's face showed genuine anguish. "I'm sorry. I am. But any contact would have revealed my location, brought people looking, and I couldn't risk that. Not for them." She reached out, took Emma's hand. "I know it sounds crazy. I know it doesn't make sense from the outside, but I made a choice to prioritize their survival over my own comfort, over your peace of mind. I'd seen something that no one was supposed to see, and I decided that some discoveries aren't meant to be shared." "But at what cost?" Emma demanded. "You lost 5 years of your life, your career, your friends, your family. For what? For animals that might not even be what you think they are." "For the certainty that I didn't cause their extinction," Claire said firmly. "That matters more to me than anything else." The legal ramifications of Claire's reappearance were complex. She hadn't committed any crime by disappearing, but the resources expended on search operations, the years of investigation. There were questions about restitution, about whether her disappearance had been a deliberate waste of public resources. In the end, no charges were filed. Claire Holloway was declared competent, given agency over her own choices, and allowed to determine her own future. That future, to everyone's surprise, didn't include returning to her old life. Claire refused to move back to Oregon, refused to resume her photography career. She accepted temporary housing in Prospect, the small Montana town that had been the center of the search operations, but made it clear she intended to return to wilderness, living as soon as she was able, just in a more officially sanctioned way. "I'll become a wilderness ranger or a fire lookout," she told Lindquist during their final official interview. "Something that lets me stay out here legally, with minimal human contact. I can't go back to cities, to crowds, to the noise and complication of modern life. I've been changed by what I experienced. I belong out here now." Lindquist studied the woman before her, trying to reconcile the confident, successful photographer from 5 years ago with this weathered survivor who'd chosen exile over exposure. "Do you regret it?" she asked. "Any of it? The decisions you made?" Claire considered the question for a long time. "I regret the pain I caused Emma and others who cared about me. I regret not finding a way to let people know I was alive without compromising the creature's safety. But do I regret protecting them? No, never. If they're going to survive, it has to be in secret. The world isn't ready to accept them, to coexist with them. Maybe it never will be. But what if they're dangerous?" Lindquist pressed. "What if someone else encounters them and gets hurt? They're dangerous, the way any large predator is dangerous, if threatened, if cornered, if protecting their young. But they're not aggressive toward humans unless given reason. I lived among them for 5 years and never felt physically threatened after that first night. They're cautious, intelligent enough to understand that attacking humans would bring retribution. She met Lindquist's eyes. The danger isn't from them. It's what we do to them if we confirm their existence. The surveillance footage from the original cabin, the trail camera images, all the evidence that had fueled years of speculation and debate, Claire refused to confirm or deny what they showed. "Interpret it however you want," she said. "Believe it's real or believe it's elaborate hoax or misidentification. Either way, the outcome is the same. They remain hidden, and that's how it needs to stay." In the end, the official case file on Claire Holloway's disappearance was closed, with an unusual notation. Subject located alive, voluntarily withdrew from society for personal reasons. No evidence of foul play or criminal activity. Subject declined to provide detailed account of time missing beyond general survival in wilderness areas. Case closed. It was unsatisfying to many. Too many loose ends. Too many unanswered questions. But it was the truth, or at least as much of the truth as Claire was willing to share. Dr. Merrill, the wildlife biologist who'd been involved in the investigation from early on, had a longer conversation with Claire before she retreated back into the wilderness. "Off the record," Merrill said, "as a scientist who spent her life studying animal behavior, what you're describing, if true, would be the most significant zoological discovery in a century. The presence of an unidentified great ape species in North America would revolutionize our understanding of primate evolution and distribution." Claire smiled faintly. "And within a decade, they'd be endangered or extinct, hunted, captured, studied to death. Their habitat would become a tourist attraction. Is that really better than them remaining a mystery?" "Some would say knowledge is always better than ignorance." "And some would say that some things are better left unknown," Claire countered, "that some mysteries serve a purpose by remaining mysterious. The world is too mapped, too catalogued, too known. Maybe there should be places that remain wild, creatures that remain free. Maybe not everything needs to be dragged into the light." Merrill had no response to that. As a scientist, she should have disagreed. But looking at Claire, healthy despite everything, purposeful, more at peace than most people ever achieved, she couldn't quite bring herself to argue. Emma eventually returned to Oregon, maintaining contact with her sister but accepting that their relationship had fundamentally changed. Claire called periodically from town, sent occasional letters, but made it clear she wouldn't be visiting, wouldn't be returning to family gatherings or normal sibling interactions. She'd become something else, something between the person she'd been and the wilderness she'd embraced. "I don't understand her choices," Emma told Lindquist during a final phone conversation, months after Claire's discovery. "But I'm trying to accept them. She's alive, she's healthy in her way, and she's chosen a life that makes sense to her. That has to be enough." "Do you believe her?" Lindquist asked. "About the creatures? About why she stayed hidden?" Emma was quiet for a long moment. "I believe she believes it. Whether that means it's objectively true or a narrative she created to cope with trauma and justify her choices, does it matter? Either way, it's her truth, and maybe that's all truth ever is. The stories we tell ourselves to make sense of experiences that don't fit normal categories." The cabin where Claire had been found was dismantled, the area restored to natural state as much as possible. The original rental cabin remained closed, preserved as evidence even though the case was officially closed. Occasionally, hikers reported unusual signs in the area, large tracks, strange vocalizations, the feeling of being watched. These reports were noted, filed, and generally dismissed as the products of overactive imaginations in people who knew the area's history. But sometimes, late at night, Sheriff Gallagher would pull out the surveillance footage and watch it again. The massive figure circling the cabin, peering in windows, reaching toward the camera with those impossible hands. He'd studied that footage hundreds of times over the years, and he still couldn't say definitively what it showed. Bear, human in costume, unknown primate. The quality was too good to dismiss as a hoax, but the implications were too extraordinary to accept without question. Maybe Claire had the right idea, he told Lindquist once, over drinks in a Prospect bar. Maybe some things shouldn't be confirmed or denied. Maybe the mystery is the point. Detective Lindquist, who dedicated years to solving this case only to have it resolve in the most unsatisfying way possible, understood what he meant. She'd wanted answers, clear explanations, the satisfaction of truth revealed. Instead, she had ambiguity, multiple possible interpretations, a resolution that satisfied no one and everyone simultaneously. But late at night, in her own moments of reflection, she thought about what Claire had said, that some things were better left unknown, that some mysteries served a purpose. And she wondered if perhaps, in our rush to explain and categorize and understand everything, we'd lost something essential. The ability to coexist with uncertainty, to accept that the world held secrets we weren't meant to uncover. As for Claire Holloway, she eventually secured a position as a fire lookout in the Bob Marshall Wilderness, living alone in a tower during fire season, spending winters in a small Forest Service cabin deep in the backcountry. She maintained minimal contact with the outside world, radioed in her observations of smoke and weather, and otherwise existed in the liminal space between civilization and wilderness. People occasionally asked her about the creatures, about what she'd seen and experienced during those 5 years. Her answers were always evasive, neither confirming nor denying, maintaining the ambiguity that protected whatever was out there. "I saw what I needed to see," she'd say, "and I made the choices I needed to make. Beyond that, it's better if some things remain uncertain." And perhaps she was right. Perhaps, in a world of satellite imagery and genetic databases, of cameras everywhere and secrets increasingly impossible to keep, there was value in preserving pockets of true mystery, places where something unknown could exist, hidden and safe, witnessed but not exposed. The Bitterroot Range holds its secrets still. The forests remain dense and deep, the wilderness vast and largely unexplored. Things move through those mountains that don't appear in guidebooks or species catalogues, following patterns older than human civilization, surviving in the spaces between knowing and not knowing. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind moves through the pines just right, you can hear something in the distance, a vocalization that might be elk, might be wind, might be something else entirely. A sound that reminds you that the world is larger and stranger than we usually acknowledge, that some mysteries are meant to remain mysterious, and that sometimes the most important discoveries are the ones we choose not to share. Claire Holloway found something in those woods 5 years ago. Whether it was an undiscovered species, a trauma-induced delusion, or something that defies easy categorization, doesn't ultimately matter. What matters is that she made a choice to protect rather than expose, to preserve rather than reveal, to prioritize mystery over certainty. Was it the right choice? That depends on what you value more, the satisfaction of answers or the preservation of wonder, the truth laid bare or the possibility that some truths are better left shrouded in shadow. The fireplace in that hidden cabin was still warm when they found her, 5 years after she vanished. Smoke still rising from the chimney, evidence of life continuing in defiance of expectation. And in the end, maybe that's the real mystery, not what Claire encountered in the wilderness, but what she became. Not the creatures that may or may not exist, but the choice to embrace uncertainty over certainty, wild over civilized, mystery over explanation. The Bitterroot Range keeps its secrets. Claire Holloway keeps hers. And somewhere in the deep forest, something moves through the shadows, unknown and unknowable, safe in the ambiguity that protects it. Some doors, once closed, stay closed for good reason. Some questions answer themselves by remaining unasked. And some people, once they've seen beyond the edges of the known world, can never quite come back. The woman who vanished in the Montana woods was found after 5 years. But the person who emerged from that wilderness wasn't quite the same one who disappeared, changed by solitude, by survival, by encounters that defied explanation. Claire Holloway had become something between, neither fully part of civilization nor entirely wild, but existing in that liminal space where mystery and reality overlap. And maybe that's where she always belonged. The case is closed. The files are sealed. The forest continues its ancient patterns, indifferent to human questions about truth and evidence and proof. And on clear nights, when the stars shine bright over the mountains and the air is perfectly still, you might hear something in the darkness. A sound that could be anything, could be nothing, could be exactly what you fear or hope it is, but you'll never know for certain. And perhaps in the end, that's exactly how it should be.